Hey, and welcome to this week's edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Do you know who the first Europeans were that actually set foot in the Greater Western New York region? Why'd they do that? And what happened when they did it? We're going to be talking about that today on this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report, which as always is brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard.
The Mendon Honey Lake Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hello and welcome to this week's version of the State of Greater Western New York Report. And we're going to be talking about something that maybe they didn't really brush up on too much when you were in school learning about Western New York history. Yeah, you might have known about what the French did in New York State, but I bet you most of it was outside the Greater Western New York region. We're going to start by recapping what they did inside inside New York State. But then we're going to talk to you about what happened in Western New York and even give you a taste for what some of the first European eyes thought when they saw the Greater Western New York region. So let's get started right away with the presentation. This is something that we worked up really pretty much, been doing for a while, studying it. Parlez-vous, the final frontier. So we might not know who the first human was to step foot in the Greater Western New York region, but we have a good idea who the first European was. Can you guess? Here's a hint. Okay, well, you already knew the hint from the title of the show. Parlez-vous, Greater Western New York, or Parlez-vous, First Frontier, another name for the Greater Western New York region. Like many of its continental competitors, the French looked to explore North America for the elusive Northwest Passage. That's the thing that bridged the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Now, the French in 1524, King Francis, of all names, King Francis I of France. You like that? He sent Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazano to chart the New World between the Spanish Florida and the English Newfoundland. Verrazano called this unclaimed coast Francesca or Nova Gaul, which no doubt pleased the interest of King Francis. Of course, it took a decade later, but in 1534, King Francis sent Jacques Cartier as the first, on the first of his three voyages to explore the North American continent. The king commissioned Cartier to discover certain islands and lands where it is said that a great quantity of gold and other precious things are to be found. Those are the words right from the commission that the king wrote. He looked all around, this is Cartier now, he looked all around the Gulf of St. Lawrence on his first voyage and found nothing. But still, he came back with a report that pleased the king, and so the king decided to send him on a second voyage. This occurred right around the year 1535. The first voyage was 1534. So in 1535, Cartier comes back a second time, and he's more determined than ever to find this passage to the Pacific. So he ventures down the St. Lawrence River up until present-day Montreal. And what does he find there? He finds a series of strong rapids. They're still there. And it made the river impassable. But this so convinced Cartier that the route that he was on actually did lead to China that he called this newly discovered obstacle the Rapides de la Chine. So like the rapids of China, I guess that's what it would come across. But these things these were a major obstacle. In fact, if you journey through these rapids today, you'll find that it's kind of perilous. And it was hard in modern times for bigger ships to go through these rapids. And in fact, it wasn't until the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959 that ocean-going vessels were finally able to escape the Great Lakes and set out into the Atlantic. You know, we all know what this meant to the then transportation hub of Buffalo, New York. You know, we don't look at the St. Lawrence Seaway the same way maybe these ship transporters do. But anyways, that's getting it to modern times. Let's go back a few more centuries and see what's going on with Jacques Cartier. He is going to spend the winter of that second voyage in a fort next to a friendly Indian village. So he spent there before he went back to France. And this is, by the way, this was the same tribe that he had met a year earlier. Today we call them the St. Lawrence Iroquoians. There was always a little bit of mystery about who these people were, but I guess they settled on that name for now to distinguish them from the other Iroquoian peoples, including the Iroquois Confederacy, the Five Nations, League of Nations, the ones that we are probably more familiar with. During that winter, by the way, a scurvy epidemic spread among both Cartier's crew and the native Indians. Now, the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, they knew how to fix this. So they introduced Cartier to the healing powers of Anida. It's a white cedar tree common to Quebec. Supposedly has a lot of vitamin C in there that cures scurvy, and it worked. So Cartier was definitely impressed. And unlike his first two voyages now, the third voyage had a different objective. His last voyage occurred several years later, 1541 to 1542. And there he was intent on starting the first colony. Well, that wasn't the only thing he was trying to do. He was also trying to find the kingdom of Saguenay, which is essentially the Canadian version of El Dorado. And Cartier succeeded at neither of these two things. So pretty much nothing happened until 1605. And that was when the French nobleman Pierre du Bois de Monts founded Port Royal. This was the first permanent French settlement in North America. But it was de Monts' partner in this venture that would gain the greatest fame and maybe have a lasting impact on the greater Western New York region. Who was this fellow? Well, he was Samuel de Champlain. He was destined to become, in essence, the father of New France, although he never held that title because he wasn't a member of royalty. He founded Quebec and New France on July 3rd, 1608. July 3rd, that's a pretty cool date, isn't it? Now you might be thinking, oh, maybe this is Canada Day. Maybe that's where Canada Day comes from. No, Canada Day is July 1st. And it actually was called originally Dominion Day, and it recognizes the July 1st, 1867 passing or enactment of the British North America Act, and that led to the creation of an independent Canada. So Canada Day has nothing to do with the creation of Quebec, even though the dates are very close. Champlain was also an accomplished cartographer. So he drew one of the first maps of New France, and this was the first one that he drew. He actually drew a better one about 2 decades later, but you get a sense for what he knew and how he handled it. So his importance, though, comes to us mainly from his role as an explorer. In July of 1609, wow, July keeps popping up in these dates, probably because it was a summer and things really happened in the summer. Anyways, this is July of 1609. He became the first European to set foot on what is now New York State. He beats Henry Hudson by about 6 weeks. After traveling down the Rivière des Iroquois, which we now know as the Richelieu River, Champlain entered the large inland lake that today bears his name. Now, if you look at that lake, you'll see a couple of points in red down there, Crown Point and Ticonderoga. You might recognize those names from the Revolutionary War, but they would actually play a part in what Champlain did in that July of 1609. So on July 29th, Champlain and his Algonquin allies spotted a group of Mohawk near what is modern-day Ticonderoga or Crown Point. Nobody knows for sure exactly where, and each of these little municipalities probably fight for the rights to say, hey, it was here that it happened. Anyways, the next day, the Mohawks advanced to attack. Now, remember, this was very early, one of the first kind of battles that we had over there. What did the Europeans have that the natives didn't? They had guns. And with one shot, Champlain killed 2 of the 3 chiefs leading the party. The third one was killed by another Frenchman. And the warriors of the Iroquois Confederacy, they just ran off. A year later, Champlain and his allies won another decisive battle, and for the next 2 decades, there was an uneasy peace between the French and the Five Nations until really the onset of the Beaver Wars, when the emboldened Iroquois Confederacy, now backed by the British, would change the political map of the greater Western New York region. But that's a story for another day. Let's go back to what was going on with Champlain. He was kind of in charge of things. And he would tell people, hey, you go do this, you go do that. And one of the people that he told to go do something was a guy by the name of Etienne Brulé. I think that's how you say it. He said, hey, travel west of the Seneca. Right now, Brulé was living with the Huron, essentially in what is today Canada, and he had to meet Champlain somewhere. So he said, go west of the Seneca. So the Seneca was up to the Genesee River, and Champlain wanted Brulé to go between the Genesee River and Lake Erie. So he was likely one of the few, if there were any other Europeans, to actually have met the Erie tribe in the course of doing this. The problem was that Brulé didn't write down any of his findings. On the other hand, Joseph de la Roche Dillon, he did. He's a Jesuit missionary priest, and he was sent from France to convert the Indian tribes in and around Niagara Peninsula, and he traveled, as a result, he traveled throughout the Western New York region in 1626 and 1627. He once said of our region that it is incomparably larger, more beautiful, and better than any other of all these countries. And he said that our winter is not too long and rigorous as Canada. No snow had fallen by the 22nd of November, and it never was over 2 feet deep. And it began to melt on the 26th of January. On the 8th of March, there was none at all in the open places, though there were a little indeed still left in the low grounds, or the woods. That's what he's talking about. So De La Roche said a stay here is quite recreating and convenient, so that I have no hesitation in saying that we should settle here rather than elsewhere. So there's no indication whether or not De La Roche was actually a member of the early Greater Western New York Chamber of Commerce, but he sure wrote that way. So, what happens next is kind of interesting, and we will get to that. What did De La Roche actually find for the first time ever, not just in Western New York, but in the entirety of North America, that actually would change the world? We'll get to that right after these messages.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
And welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York report. If you have any questions, just put them down in the Q&A. And, after you look up his, okay, sorry about the audio there. I can't really see all the questions as they pop up, only because I'm working an entire board here. But I will try my best to do better with the audio. So let's go back to what we are looking at right now. And we're talking about Laroche and what he discovered. So actually, I know that one of our listeners or watchers who's on the live broadcast is going to be interested in this particular tidbit of information, only because of where it's located. Well, what did Laroche do? He was the first European to discover oil in North America when the neutral chief, Sobersarian, he was so trusting of Laroche that he agreed to take the priest to a sacred place northwest of what is today the village of Cuba. There, he introduced Laroche to a natural springs, I could say spring. So this black substance he called, a really hard name to pronounce, I think it's Atarantum. Anyways, it was bubbling up through the land, and the neutral, and later the Seneca tribe, assumed that these tainted waters contain medicinal properties. If you drink the waters, weird stuff happened, and the natives thought that they were actually, hey, that was a good sign. It means that they were medicine. It was working. Anyways, this black ooze was, of course, oil, and Laroche thereby became the first European to lay eyes on the resource, and Oil Springs, which is now called, became the first place in North America where oil was discovered. So who knew? Who knew that it was that significant? And of course, that kind of drives the world economy today. So the next thing that Laroche did that was kind of interesting was he was likely the first continental to see Niagara Falls. And that's assuming that it wasn't Brule. But again, Brule didn't write down anything, so we don't know exactly what he saw or what he did. But Laroche definitely said he saw Niagara Falls. But it was, of course, Louis Hennepin who first described the eighth wonder of the world in his 1699 book, A New Discovery, on page 22. He said, and this is how he described it, "Betwixt the Lake Erie and Ontario, there is a vast and prodigious cadence of water, which falls down after a surprising and astonishing manner, insomuch that the universe does not afford its parallel. 'Tis true, Italy and Swadeland," that's what he called it, "boast of some such things, but we may well say that they are but sorry patterns when compared to this of which we now speak." He continues, "At the foot of this horrible precipice, we meet with the river Niagara, which is not above half a quarter of a league broad, but it is wonderfully deep in some places. It is so rapid above this descent that it violently hurries down the wild beasts while endeavoring to pass it, to feed on the other side, they not being able to withstand the force of its current, which inevitably casts them down headlong above 600 foot. So that was a description actually from the 1670s when he traveled there. And how do we know that? Because who did he travel with? Well, he took a tour of Western New York with none other than René-Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle. That's right, La Salle, the French explorer, who had earlier toured Lake Ontario, leaving his vessel, the Frontenac, to rest beneath the waves. It's a famous shipwreck, and it occurred at about the 30-mile point, which you see in that little mark on the map here. But La Salle was not deterred by this mishap. And in fact, when he got to the mouth of the Niagara River, he built Fort Conty. And it's where the Niagara River emptied into Lake Ontario. In hope to use that fort as a way to control the fur trade. But it was burned later that same year, and we don't know exactly why. There's some who speculate that the French soldiers who were garrisoned there didn't want to spend the winter there, so they burned it down and went back to the other fort they came from, which actually was called Fort Frontenac. Anyways, this was the first of 3 forts built on this same location. The second one was called Fort de Nonville, and that was built by Jacques-René de Brissac de Nonville, otherwise known as the Marquis de Nonville. And he built that in the summer of 1687 during his campaign against the Seneca. It, too, was abandoned just about a year later in September of 1688. So, de Nonville at this point, the French are at war with the Seneca. We go to the next phase, the third fort. This was called the Magasin Royal or the Maison de la Paix, which it means either royal store or house of peace. And Louis-Thomas Chabert de Joncaire obtained permission from the Seneca people to erect the building. So 20 years before, or actually 40 years before, they were at war. Now there's a peace, and so the French are able to build this third fort there. In fact, it was French engineer Gaspard Joseph Chérard de Liry. He built this 2-story house of peace in 1720, and the building still stands today. We call it Fort Niagara. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We're way far ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to La Salle. And by the summer of 1679, the fort was already built by this point. At this point, La Salle, he had approached his wit's end. His faithful lieutenant, the Napolitan Henri de Tonty, he had already repulsed one attempt by the Seneca tribe to burn La Salle's soon-to-be sailing ship Le Griffon. A year earlier, in hopes of attaining a promise of peace, La Salle actually traveled from Niagara to the Seneca village of Ganondagan. This is about 75 miles east of where La Salle was building the boat. So that village is located at present-day Boughton Hill, just outside the village of Victor in Ontario County, about 20 miles south of Rochester. That's where it is. So peace was promised, but as the attempted arson later proved, it wasn't necessarily guaranteed. So what did La Salle end up doing? He kind of pushed ahead of the schedule of things. On August 7th, 1679, La Salle gave the order to weigh anchor and commanded 12 burly sailors to grab those tow lines and walk. They walked Le Griffon from the shallow 10-foot waters of Squaw Island through the rushing rapids of the Niagara River, and really, with the help of a northeast breeze, into the calm waters of what, in his native tongue, in La Salle's native tongue, called Lac du Cat, which is the Cat Lake, or the Lake of Cats, because the Erie tribe was called the Cat tribe. And in fact, so Lac du Cat really means Lake Erie. And off he goes to sail not the ocean blue, but the lake blue. And this mission, again, remember, he's searching for the Northwest Passage. And he already knew about Lake Huron and all that kind of stuff. So La Salle took Le Griffon through the Great Lakes, and it really became the first large ship to grace the waters of the Great Lakes above Niagara Falls. Now, here's what happened. On the return home, Le Griffon was lost. La Salle wasn't on it. La Salle, stayed off it, and nobody really knows what happened to Le Griffon. It just disappeared. It was gone. We don't know if Gordon Lightfoot ever wrote a song about it, but it was lost somewhere in the Great Lakes. La Salle, by the way, he would meet his own end via mutiny down in Texas a few years later. Remember, he was primarily an explorer, so the French sent him all over the place. Where did we end up, or what did we end up by the end of this little, I guess, period for France, not just within the greater Western New York region? I mean, remember, the French had these Jesuit missionaries all over these villages, these Indian villages within Western New York, but also in Canada and elsewhere. And that was a major way we got information. In fact, the Roche, I should say, the Rock. That's why I said that. So LaRoche, he was really the first chronicle of the pre-Beaver Wars, Western New York. That's when these other tribes were still here. The Beaver Wars, of course, wiped out these other tribes. By the end of the Beaver Wars, New France was huge. It covered a substantial portion of the interior of North America. Now, there was a small problem. The Iroquois also claimed a lot of this territory. And it was a question as to, how do we get there, and what happened next. So those are questions that come obvious when we look at this map, and we wonder exactly, what's going on. I'll put this map up here behind me so you can see it. Whoop, there it is. So you have two things going on. You have this expansion. France, Britain is already also kind of expanding, but in a different way, because they were expanding in terms of population. At the same time, you also have a third party, a third European country involved, and we're going to be talking about that later. But this whole thing, it was just a conflict that was brewing, and it was bound to boil over, and it did. Although boiling over is probably not the right way to describe it, because the Beaver Wars really took most of the 17th century to fight. There were a series of battles or conflicts. It wasn't just one long continuous war. And at the same time, you had wars in Europe, you had wars in other wars in North America, wars between the European countries, wars between the native tribes. It was a big, huge mess, and it was all done for the pelt of a beaver. Well, that's pretty much it for today. Thanks for being a part of today's show, and thanks for watching. And let me just make sure there were no other questions. Hopefully the audio got fixed for you guys. Don't worry, if you are a member of the audience, you can always ask a question anytime, and you will hopefully get an answer from the host or the guest, whoever that may be. Just go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and sign up. It's free, and every Thursday morning you'll get the link to the YouTube show, and you'll be able to see what's going on. Thank you, anonymous attendee. That's weird. You're anonymous. I don't even see you on my list. I guess you really are anonymous. You can ask a question if you can't make the show. And I realize a lot of people work. This is at noon on Thursdays. You can watch the show on our archive site. That's the same thing, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. You'll be able to see that and anything else. If you want to actually see the broadcast or be reminded of the broadcast, we rebroadcast this every Sunday at 1:30 on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. If you like the page, or if you go and I guess it's subscribe to the YouTube channel, as long as you do those things, when it's rebroadcast, then you will be notified by those platforms that is happening. So with that, I think that we'll say goodbye for this week, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye for now.